Hello, welcome to Bio 23 discussion on Chapter 13, Viral and Prion Diseases. In this chapter, we're going to be talking about viruses, which are different from bacteria. Bacteria we discussed in the last chapter. Viruses, remember, are small subcellular particles that are not considered alive. They are, in fact, not even cells. They're just molecules that are able to replicate. This is different from bacteria in that bacteria are cells and are living things. Viruses are also much smaller and require a host cell in order to replicate. In the last chapter, we talked about how bacteria can cause disease. They enter in one particular way, and they affect those areas of the body. That is because the mode of transmission and the route of entry of bacteria in the body often correlate with the organ systems that are affected. For example, if you were to get sick and have vomiting and diarrhea from a bacterial infection, you probably acquired that bacterial infection from eating. However, viruses don't always play by those rules. These small subcellular particles can travel easily around the body, and as a result can enter in a variety of different ways, usually not restricted to one portal of entry, and as a result can also affect many different areas of the body. Another big difference between the last chapter in bacteria and this chapter with viruses is that antibiotics were often effective with treating bacteria. However, antibiotics cannot treat viral infections. There are some antiviral drugs that'll target viral replication, but these are not antibiotics. And many viral infections don't have any treatment at all. Instead, it's just supportive in that we support the different organ systems of the body until the body can fight off the infection itself. This is why many viruses are, in fact, combated with modern medicine today by vaccines instead of treatments like antibiotics. So instead of waiting for a person to get sick and then providing them with drugs to cure them, vaccines allow the body to fight off the infection to begin with. And as a result, you never get sick. Also, with bacteria, since they are cells, you can see them under a light microscope. Viruses, however, you're unable to do that. For instance, this picture that we're going to be seeing later on in this chapter shows us Ebola viruses attacking a single cell. This picture was not taken by a light microscope, however, it was taken by an electron microscope. And electron microscopes are not available in hospitals. They're just too expensive and impractical. As a result, while many bacterial infections are diagnosed by looking at specimens under the microscope or growing samples on a Petri plate, viruses are not diagnosed this way. Most viruses are diagnosed by unique or well-known signs and symptoms that are seen on infected individuals. There are some viruses that can be diagnosed by presence of proteins or antigens in the body, or evidence of our immune system fighting them, such as antibodies in our body. But these tests are usually fairly expensive, and as a result, most viral diseases are diagnosed by simply looking at signs and symptoms of the patient. The first section that we're going to be talking about are viruses that are carried in food and water. All of the viruses discussed in this section are naked viruses. Naked viruses are so named because they have the nucleic acid, either DNA or RNA, at the core, and then that is surrounded by a protein coat called a capsid. They do not, however, contain an additional layer on top of that, the viral envelope, which is made of a fatty phospholipid membrane stolen from the host cell. Instead, these naked viruses are just the nucleic acid surrounded by the protein capsid. That's likely because they don't need the membrane to be protected, since they are going to be carried in food and water. However, naked viruses without the membrane layer are not affected by hand sanitizer like Purell. So, the only way, or the best way, that you can prevent transmission of these infections is to wash your hands. Washing your hands physically removes the viruses off of your hand cell surface instead of trying to destroy their molecular structure like Purell does. Many of these infections cause what's referred to as gastroenteritis. Gastroenteritis is characterized by stomach and abdominal pain, diarrhea, vomiting, and abdominal cramps as a result of infection or inflammation in the stomach or large or small intestines. Many people refer to having the stomach flu, but there really is no such thing. Instead, many of the cases that people refer to as a stomach flu can be caused by a variety of different pathogens, including viruses, but also including bacteria and sometimes even protozoa. When you have gastroenteritis, one of the biggest problems is dehydration. Here in the United States, we have treated water sources, so dehydration can often be alleviated just by drinking tap water. However, in other countries, local water sources could be contaminated with the very thing that's making you sick, only making your condition worse the more you try to quench your thirst. This is why diarrhea is one of the leading causes of death of children under 5 worldwide. The mode of transmission of these viruses that cause gastroenteritis is the oral fecal route, also sometimes referred to as the fecal-oral route. The oral fecal route is when a virus is acquired by ingestion, either eating or drinking food or water, and then that virus escapes the host from the feces. By simply not washing your hands, you could then transmit this pathogen to another host. These types of infections are likely to occur in schools, daycare centers, cruise ships, dormitories, nursing homes, military barracks, refugee camps, and disaster relief camps, where there's close quarters and a larger chance that somebody may end up touching something that was contaminated by somebody else who did not wash their hands. One of the most frequent causes of gastroenteritis is norovirus. Norovirus is the leading cause, in fact, of vomiting and diarrhea in the United States. There are very few viral particles that are needed to cause an infection, allowing norovirus to transmit quite easily from person to person. Norovirus also lasts in the environment for extended periods of time, much longer than many other viruses. And they're very resistant to inactivation by hand sanitizer and other forms of disinfectant. The best thing that you can do is wash your hands with soap and water and decontaminate surfaces with bleach or hydrogen peroxide. A second common foodborne and waterborne virus is hepatitis A and E. Hepatitis in general is a description of a disease that is a result of inflammation of the liver. In fact, hepatitis can be caused by a wide variety of different factors, but it is most commonly associated with being caused by hepatitis viruses. There are hepatitis A, B, C, and E, but of the food and waterborne ailments, it's only hepatitis A and E. One of the ways that you know you have hepatitis in general is exhibited by the symptom known as jaundice. Jaundice is a yellowing of the skin and eyes, as you can see from this picture here. This is a result of increased levels of a protein called bilirubin in the blood, which is a result of abnormal liver function. Hepatitis A is the most common form of hepatitis that's transmitted in food. It's usually very mild and self-limiting in that it is cleared by the body fairly easily. The average incubation time is approximately 30 days, making it difficult to trace where the original source of the hepatitis came from. Recovery is usually complete, and there is often no associated chronic infection associated with hepatitis A, unlike some other forms of hepatitis. Hepatitis A is not just transmitted by food or water, it can also be transmitted by oral sex. About half of the cases of hepatitis A are subclinical, meaning that they are never diagnosed and the patient never even knows they have it. Diagnosis, however, is based on laboratory detection of antibodies in the blood serum. There is no specific treatment available, and so that means that if you do have hepatitis A, the only thing you can do is try to alleviate the symptoms. Thankfully, there is a vaccine against hepatitis A, and the CDC recommends that all children in the United States be vaccinated against it within their first couple of years of life. A lot less commonly found is hepatitis E, which is most generally transmitted through contaminated drinking water in developing countries. But hepatitis E is not very common in the United States. It has occurred sometimes in the United States from the consumption of uncooked or undercooked pork or deer meat or raw shellfish. Unfortunately, hepatitis E is the only hepatitis virus that we're going to be talking about in this chapter that does not have a vaccine. All other hepatitis viruses do. Here you can see a distribution of hepatitis A and E in areas or countries with moderate to high risk. So if you are planning on traveling, it is well advised that you do get the vaccine if you have not yet been vaccinated against it. The next virus that we're going to talk about that's transmitted by food or waterborne illness is poliomyelitis, generally referred to as polio. Poliomyelitis is also known as infantile paralysis because it has resulted in the paralysis of infants as a result of infection. Polio used to be extremely common around the world, but as a result of vaccines, there's only very few countries that are currently holdouts of polio. In most countries, like the United States, it has been completely eradicated. The hope is that in the next 5 to 10 years, those last few holdouts around the world will eventually no longer have polio, and polio will join smallpox as being a disease, a human disease that has been completely eradicated off of Earth from vaccines. There are two types of polio vaccines. There's the Salk vaccine, which uses killed or inactivated polioviruses, and the Sabin vaccine, which is comprised of a live, weakened version of the virus. The Sabin vaccine is given as an oral vaccine, which is quite unusual, but much more pleasant than the injections that some people receive. If you are familiar with vaccines, you probably think that all vaccines are injected, but the Sabin vaccine is given as drops on the tongue. The Sabin vaccine is fantastic in that it targets the exact areas of the body where the virus normally infects, namely the digestive tract. In the United States, we use this Sabin vaccine. As mentioned before, many cases of polio are asymptomatic in that most people don't know they're infected. But what we're going to talk about in the next section is symptoms that do occur in the small number of individuals that experience them.